This is a fun one, and this is going to be a tough pill for some prohibitionists to swallow. Study finds no evidence that medical marijuana causes cognitive impairment in patients with chronic health problems. The findings of a study examining marijuana's neurocognitive effects suggest that prescribed medical cannabis may have minimal acute impact on cognitive function among patients with chronic health conditions, which may come as relief to long-term cannabis patients who are concerned about potential neurological drawbacks of the drug. Authors of the report, published last month in the peer-reviewed journal CNS Drugs, wrote that they found, quote, no evidence for impaired cognitive function when comparing baseline with post-treatment scores. So this is peer-reviewed, okay? To conduct the study, researchers had 40 people in Australia self-administer a single dose of medical marijuana in a laboratory setting following instructions on the product label. Participants were then tested on an array of neuropsychological metrics, including multitasking, pattern recognition memory, reaction time, rapid visual information processing, and spatial working memory, among others, and surveyed on their subjective experience. Quote, the absence of evidence for cognitive impairment following medical cannabis self-administration was surprising, the study says. Not to me. Given prior and substantive evidence that non-medical recreational cannabis use reliably impairs a range of cognitive functions. At the same time, these findings are consistent with two systematic reviews published in the last year that suggest that medical cannabis, when used regularly and consistently for a chronic health concern, may have little, if any, impact on cognitive function. Researchers also found little evidence between participants who consumed flower versus oil to suggest that the magnitude of change in cognitive function differed with product type. I can attest to that, and anybody that's used any variations of cannabis knows the flower effect is not the same as edibles, and edibles are not the same as oil, and so on and so forth, because you digest them and it goes into your body different ways. Researchers did find some differences in effects between participants who consumed cannabis flower and concentrate. However, relative to participants who self-administered oil, those who self-administered flower rated themselves as more stoned, hit them quicker, that's why, 1 hour after consumption, as well as more sedated, the study says. Participants who self-administered flower rated themselves as more confident than those who self-administered oil, although this difference was only statistically significant at the 4-hour time point. That makes sense because edibles and oil goes under your tongue, goes pretty quickly. But if you take an edible, that takes a while to kick in and get in your bloodstream. The report points out that cannabis tolerance increases with longer-term use, citing a 2021 study in which occasional users who were given a dose of THC, quote, exhibited significant alternations in reward circuitry, as well as impaired performance on a sustained attention task. Chronic cannabis users administered the same dose of THC did not exhibit the same neurometabolic alterations or performance decrements, despite reporting a significant increase in intoxication relative to placebo. Considering this emerging evidence for pharmacodynamic tolerance to the effects of cannabis, they continued, considering this emerging evidence for pharmacodynamic tolerance to the effects of cannabis, stable dosing with THC and gradual dose titration up until and not beyond the point that effective symptom relief is achieved is likely critical for any potential mitigation of impairment. The report advised people to take potential impairment into account, especially early on and after any increase in dosages. So this goes to the study about breathalyzers also. Side note, that when you're driving on alcohol, right, somebody could have 5 or 6 beers and be seemingly okay to drive because they have a high tolerance. Now, that doesn't mean they still don't have the blood alcohol in their system, but their impairment is not affected. They can still drive home. Glass of wine, 2 glasses of wine, something like that. Same thing. So how are they going to determine how recently you used cannabis if you're driving? They don't have that ability yet. Performing safety-sensitive tasks such as driving is therefore not advised until patients are taking a stable dose of THC. It should also be temporarily avoided following any increase in THC dose. And I just have to say, do not smoke, consume, or drive. And don't drink and drive. I got my car totaled by a drunk driver on January 1st, New Year's Day, about 20 years ago, and it was not fun. So please don't drink and drive. Please don't get stoned and drive. The lack of evidence for cognitive impairment may be due in part to the fact that participants were regular users of medical marijuana. Most, 92.5%, had been using medical marijuana for more than a month before starting the trial, and all patients reported daily cannabis use. Past studies that found impairment, by contrast, included a requirement that patients avoid cannabis for 30 days prior to participating. Speaking of avoiding cannabis for 30 days, I'm about to do a dry January and take a tolerance break. Yeah, that's why I'm going to take a break. I'm going to take a tolerance break in January for that 30 days and just kind of reset my system. The fact that these patients were not taking a stable dose of medical cannabis might explain why we found no evidence for acute cognitive impairment in the current study. In terms of how effective medical marijuana treatment was among participants, authors noted that patients self-reported a mean improvement of their condition of 78.6% since beginning cannabis treatment. Among some of the study's limiting factors were that it lacked a placebo, which authors said means we were unable to disentangle the baseline performance from possible residual impairment resulting from medical cannabis use the evening prior. Participants also weren't screened for other drugs prior to the trial. On top of that, they noted that the controlled use of medical marijuana might not match how patients use the drug in the real world. For instance, patients may typically only use medical cannabis in the evening before sleeping. As patients had been using medical cannabis for more than 10 months on average, these findings cannot be generalized to patients who are just commencing treatment with medical cannabis or changing dose or product type. While the long-term effects of cannabis use are far from settled science, findings from a number of recent studies suggest fears have been overblown. Well, I just want to put 2 or 3 or 4 examples out there for you to do observational studies of long-term cannabis use. So Snoop Doggy Dogg, is he still around? Yep, he's still around. Been smoking for 50, 60 years. And he's not overweight. He's pretty thin. And he's pretty successful. Willie Nelson, same. Lived a good, long life. Cheech and Chong lived a good, long life. Seth Rogen's doing all right. But anyways, a report published in April that drew on dispensary data, for instance, found that cancer patients reported being able to think more clearly when using medical cannabis. They also said it helped manage pain. That's why they can think clearly. Their pain is going down, so they have a little bit more of their brain power to not focus on the pain. They can focus on living. A separate study of teens and young adults at risk of developing psychotic disorders found that regular marijuana use over a 2-year period did not trigger early onset of psychosis symptoms, contrary to the claims of prohibitionists who argue that cannabis causes mental illness. In fact, it was associated with modest improvements in cognitive functioning and reduced use of other medications. Here. Quote, CHR youth who continually use cannabis had higher neurocognition and social functioning over time and decreased medication usage relative to non-users. Surprisingly, clinical symptoms improved over time despite the medication decreases. A separate study published in the American Medical Association in January looked at data from more than 63 million health insurance beneficiaries, found that there's, quote, no statistically significant increase in psychosis-related diagnoses in states that have legalized marijuana compared to those that continue to criminalize cannabis. So, the American Medical Association said in January that the prohibitionists going around yelling and fear-mongering you that you're going to get psychosis are literally wrong. How do you like them apples? Studies from 2018, meanwhile, found that marijuana may actually increase working memory and that cannabis use doesn't actually change the structure of the brain. There's another one for the books. This is amazing. I love it. It's a plant. That's all I'm going to say. And contrary to then President Trump's claim that marijuana makes people lose IQ points, the National Institute of Drug Abuse says the results of 2 longitudinal studies did not support a causal relationship between marijuana use and IQ loss. Yeah, again, when you make those claims, tell me who's funding you without telling me who's funding you. Okay? If you're any candidate or any politician and you are truly for freedom of all kind, you will at the very least, have a decriminalization hands-off approach and let the states decide, at the very least. Research has shown that people who use cannabis can see declines in verbal ability and general knowledge, but that, quote, those who would use in the future already had lower scores on those measures than those who would not use in the future, and no predictable difference was found between twins when one used marijuana and one did not. Interesting. This suggests that observed IQ declines, at least across adolescence, may be caused by shared familiar factors, e.g. genetics, family environment, not by marijuana use itself, NIDA concluded. So what they're saying is what advocates have been saying forever. Cannabis doesn't make you do anything. You do that. And any person that's about self-control, self-discipline, and general health is going to say it's self-control. Now, there's evidence right there, multiple studies proving and debunking all of these myths. Cannabis causes psychosis. Nope. Peer-reviewed, debunked. Cannabis makes you drive worse. Well, study conducted. Nope. That's false. We're living in the time where they are just grabbing for straws. They're just grasping for anything that might stick because it's fear. And people are not afraid of cannabis anymore. If anything, they're actually interested in it because they're trying to quit drinking. Now, might be another reason why it's illegal. So I love when studies find evidence or no evidence confirming or disproving anyone's preconceived notions, including mine. Again, I don't want to be right. I want to get it right. And I want everyone to get it right too. And that's what science is for. So science is never settled. It's just always ongoing. Now, in 10, 15 years, if it comes out that smoking cannabis for 10 or 20 years is the worst thing in the world, I will eat crow and say I was so wrong and I'm so sorry. I don't see that being the case because, again, let's go back to Snoop Dogg, Cheech and Chong, Willie Nelson, Sha'Carri Richardson. There's so many successful people, Michael Phelps, using cannabis. So I think the jig is up, especially when the study finds no evidence that medical marijuana causes cognitive impairment. Good news day, so stay blessed.